Hello, everyone. I thought I'd just make some comments on the week 3 study questions about um, Facebook experiment. The first one is, I would say, um, well, they're both trying to apply the ethical decision-making frameworks we were introduced to in week 1 to this situation. There is no correct answer in the sense there's no, I don't know whether the experiment violated either of the categorical imperatives or whether it conformed to the greatest happiness principle. There are arguments on both sides. I don't know. I guess I have my ideas. Number one, did the Facebook experiment violate either of the categorical imperatives? Why or why not? So it's just really an exercise in trying to work it out for yourself. The first categorical imperative says that my maxim of action must be capable of serving as a law for everyone, as a universal law. So it's the first step, of course, is to figure out what the maxim of action would be in this case. What would Facebook or the people at Facebook who devised and approved of this experiment, what was the maxim of action? What was the rule of action that they were following? That if there's no way of putting it, right? There's no one way of putting it. If the data promises to give us greater insight into human social behavior, then go ahead and perform an experiment on somebody without their knowledge. That would be one way of doing it, I suppose. And I suppose if you formulated the maxim of action that way, it would be pretty tough to say that it could serve as universal law. But you could tweak the maxim of action if it promises to give urgent or important insight into social media, which is a growing and essential part of modern life, and the results or the impacts on the subjects of the experiment promise to be minimal, then go ahead and perform an experiment on them without their knowledge. Maybe that if you could get away with that one, maybe it would seem more universalizable. It would be easier to stand behind it as something that could serve as a law for everyone. But I don't know. I mean, what is the actual maxim of action? There are so many different ways of putting it. If manipulating somebody's emotional states without their knowledge is necessary to gain insight into an important social practice, then go ahead and do it. I mean, again, that's why I think that when you're applying, at least it tells us that when you're applying the first categorical imperative, it's incredibly important to set out what you take to be the maxim of action or rule of action. It's just incredibly important. And then we ask ourselves, obviously, once we've done it, whether it is something that could serve as a law for everyone. And the basis upon which you do that, as I've said in previous videos, pretty murky, but you kind of have to do it. So did Facebook violate the first categorical imperative? I don't know. Maybe. Probably. Second categorical imperative seems, at least on the surface, to be more clear. That is, second categorical imperative says that you should always treat persons as ends in themselves and never as a means to an end. And we can extrapolate on that, saying you should never use a person, you should never exploit a person, you should never treat a person like a thing. But the imperative itself says you should never treat a person as a mere means to one of your ends. And it does certainly seem that, especially without seeking anybody's consent to be part of this experiment, that the subjects of the experiment were actually used as means to somebody's end, the experimenters, Facebook, whatever, and that it's a violation of the second categorical imperative. And I'll probably say that it was, but even that's not completely clear. Because it would have implications for a lot of other things in life, I think. It would rule out a lot of other things, if you think about it. Because there are areas of life in which it does seem that some form of manipulation, maybe even deception, is something that's a tolerable part of society, maybe even a necessary part of society. If we can't, if this experiment does in fact violate the second categorical imperative, then it would seem that perhaps other things too would have to be said to do so as well. Thinking of advertising, thinking of any sort of propaganda, political propaganda, corporate propaganda, anything where people where you're trying to change somebody's mind without maybe being fully truthful about what your intent is. That's just maybe not the closest example, but I would say that probably the second categorical imperative was violated in the Facebook experiment. But even that, I mean, well, if that constitutes a violation, then aren't there a lot of other things in life that would constitute one too? So, maybe there's an argument on the other side that it wasn't. Number two, did the Facebook experiment conform to the greatest happiness principle? Why or why not? Well, I mean, that's an empirical question. Right? Greatest happiness principle is the first principle of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism. So, whether or not the act was good depends upon whether its results promoted the greatest happiness or not. And that is an empirical question, and probably it's a judgment call. Right? I mean, how much harm did it cause in terms of manipulating people? Some of the material that we've read indicates it was quite dangerous indeed to manipulate people's moods. So maybe on that basis, it was just reckless. So if it could have been anticipated to have disastrous consequences for some people, and obviously it shouldn't have been done, but what did it end up having those consequences? Did it really? I don't know. And that has to be balanced about what was the social good of the experiment to begin with. How much insight did it give to us about the effects of different sort of posts in our Facebook feed and the impact on our emotional states? So it's a judgment call. What were the risks, I suppose, so that would a reasonable person have done it, knowing the risks? What were the actual impacts, both negative and positive? And you have to sort of weigh them up. If one could argue that, and it is argued in at least one of the things I remember that we read for this week, that we need to keep doing these sort of experiments because we need to have an understanding of the effects of social media on us. That's vitally important, and there's something to be said for that. But then again, given the very sensitive nature of it, and the possibility for something going disastrously wrong from manipulating somebody's mood, basically, it's something you want to do. So, free to say it's, I don't know, a judgment call in both cases, I guess.